All right, I think we are live. Can anyone hear me from the attendees? I want to make sure that everyone can hear me. Sounds good. Okay, I think it's 5 p.m. already, so we will start. Welcome to the Hack the Coding interview workshop. Please scan the QR code so that you check in for the event. It is important to us as well as for the attendees, and let us know if you like the presentation. I'll give a couple of minutes to scan the QR code, and then we'll start. Okay, at any point in the presentation, if you have any questions or you want me to go on the previous slide, please let me know. I will be monitoring the chat, and I'll make sure to respond to any questions you might have. Okay, so overview. In this technical workshop, we'll go over the internships, quickly go over the general information about the internships, what they are, what is happening before you get your first coding interview, what are the job applications, a couple of words about the resume, as well as the job postings. Then we'll go over the technical assessment, some interview questions, and then we will go over some of the solutions to some easy coding questions that you might get in your future interviews. So what is an internship and why do you need one? Internships are short-term practical experiences at a company, somewhere between 3 and 12 months that a person spends working on projects related to their major. If you're a computer science student, projects might include anything from building a website from scratch, analyzing some kind of data for a real-world problem, designing robots, or maybe even building machine learning models. It all comes down to what company you get to do your internship at. It is important to try to get an internship during your studies so that you can get experience at a company working on projects that are related to your future career. Spending time with the real-world problems might give you a better understanding of what you want to do. On the right, you can see a well-known acronym among computer science interns, FANG, which consists of 5 top companies that people want to work at: Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google. I have to say that I say that people want to work at, but for each person, there's a specific company that they might work at, and it might not be necessarily the biggest company there out there. So it's all about finding the right fit and making sure that you enjoy the work you're doing. So before the coding interview, it all starts with a job posting. On the right, you can see an example of a software engineering internship posting. This particular one is from Google. It's based in Singapore. As you can see on the top corner of the posting, you have your big blue apply button, as well as some of the minimum qualifications that you must meet to be able to be considered for the internship. You also have preferred qualifications, such as ability to work on projects and some other skills that when recruiter sees them on your resume will help you stand out from the crowd. Some of the postings might also have a section that is called About Us section or About This Position section. And in these sections, you can read about the company, the work that they're doing, and you can also read about what kind of projects are going to be on the internship that you're going to work on specifically. Resume. Now, I know that multiple organizations on campus, multiple clubs always talk about resumes and how resume is important. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about that. But on the right side, you can see an example of a very good resume that got the student an internship at Google. You can see that it's very standard. It's one column. It has all the sections. It has education, employment, projects. Everything is very standard. There's little to no coloring or any other style. You see that there are some of the words highlighted in bold. And this is an example of what the resume that you can find. But you also should remember that resume is not the only thing on your application, because there are always projects, there are always some kind of transcript, portfolio, and some of the employers ask for cover letters. So you should not forget about that. Applying to jobs. Very important stage for your job applications. A couple of tips that I have with regards to applying for internships are: apply early. It is a very competitive process to get an internship in computer science, and you should take advantage of early applications. As soon as the application is posted, there will be 50, 100, 150 students already applying for the internship, and you want to get all the chances of getting an internship and landing a job of your dreams. Second tip that I have is search for relevant opportunities. It is very important to find something that interests you, let it be rockets, websites, trading, machine learning, etc. It is good to figure out what you want to do early on. Just look up some topics on Google and see if you like them. If it's machine learning, look up what machine learning is for and how to get a career in it. If you're interested in some kind of other scientific inquiry, just explore it. Just find some articles about it and see if you can get an internship in that area. And finally, the last thing, and probably the most important thing that I just discovered for myself, is practice as much as you can, since the interview questions are hard and it might be difficult sometimes to balance coursework as well as try to prepare for the interviews at the same time. So practicing is very, very important, and we're going to talk about that later. Online technical assessment and how it looks like. Online assessment is, Online assessment is a time test that is usually a first or a second stage of the interview process that tests your programming skills and your coding skills. On the right side, you can see an example of an email invitation to online assessment that was sent to me at some point. You see a big green button that says Start Challenge. You see a deadline by which you have to complete the challenge. And usually you will have some other information, such as your contact information, maybe some description of what kind of tasks that you're going to be asked, some general rules, policies, etc. It's very important to read what they're saying to you and prepare accordingly. Online assessment structure. On the right side, you can see an example of how your coding screen might look like when you're taking an online assessment. You have your problem statement on the left. So you see the white portion. It tells you the examples for the problem. It tells you inputs, outputs. It also describes the problem itself and gives some syntax tips for this particular problem. On the right side, which is the darker side, it shows you your coding area. You can write code there. It highlights the syntax for you. It also provides you with tests and with options to submit your assignment or test it on various inputs. Technical interview and what to expect. Let's talk briefly about the technical interviews. Technical interviews usually follow the technical assessment. You are paired with a recruiter or an engineer over the phone or other online platform, and they ask you questions about coursework, coding problems, as well as personality problems, or just personality questions. If you are invited on site, just like in company's headquarters or some other office area, then you might probably engage in a process called whiteboarding. As you can see on the picture on the right, it means that you're solving algorithmic problems using a marker on a whiteboard. It's more difficult than some people might think because you have to write down your solution very precisely. You have to think out loud and explain every single steps of what are you going to do. Some problems require follow-up questions. So for example, if you provided the solution to the first part of the problem, a recruiter might ask you to elaborate or provide some kind of other difficulty, and you have to solve it on the spot. Behavior portion. Behavior portion is usually the last thing in an interview process, and it's called a behavioral interview. Companies like Amazon might reject the best coders just because they didn't study company values or they just didn't align with them psychologically. So for example, Amazon might ask some questions like, tell me about yourself, or tell me about the most difficult problem that you have faced and how did you overcome it. It is important that you also prepare for these kinds of questions as they are harder than you might think. They look for specific psychological traits and values. So for example, when you say, tell me about yourself, they look in your presentation ability, or they talk about your strengths, or when they ask about your weaknesses, you have to tell them about an actual weakness that you have, but you also have to mention what steps are you taking to overcome it. So on the picture on the right, you see a rule that describes how to respond to these kinds of questions. So you have situation, you have task, action, and result. So for example, one of the questions that I had in my interview was, what was the most difficult problem that you have faced and how did you overcome it? And so for these kind of questions, you have to follow this formula. And so you describe the situation first, and then you say, what did you do? What kind of contribution did you do to solve the problem? Then you say what task was posed to this problem and who participated in that problem. And at the end, you have your results. And it has to be all concise, very, very coherent, and you have to make sure that recruiter understands you to be able to receive the most marks for these kind of questions. Finally, we got to the coding portion of our workshop. Now we can finally talk about some kind of problems that you might be asked in an interview. We also will go over some important concepts in coding, as well as some platform-specific questions. So if you have any issues understanding me, please let me know in the chat. I'll respond to any questions you might have, let it be programming or some other questions. So the first problem that we are going to look at is called an array sum. Array sum is a problem that is designed to get you familiar with the platform. And in this case, the platform is HackerRank. It is a very popular platform for testing and online assessments. It is being used by a lot of companies. Some of them are IBM, Goldman Sachs, Robinhood, and a lot of other companies. And it is important that you're familiar with this kind of platform and you're comfortable taking interviews. So this problem uses the concept in programming known as array. Array is simply a collection of elements that have the same type. So for example, we have this array called scores, and each element of this array is an integer. You have 56, 50, 34, 24, 12. Each of those elements are indexed using positions in an array. Whoops. I'm sorry, I apologize. Whoops. Okay. Many programming languages use a system called zero-based indexing. So for example, the number 56, which is the first element in an array, it's indexed by the number 0. The next number will be 1, 2, 3, and 4. So in this array, you have 5 elements, and each of those elements have indexes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Some languages like R, for example, use a indexing system that starts with 1, but most programming languages use the 0-based indexing system. The way you access elements in an array is by calling an operator square brackets. So for example, if you have an array called scores, you say scores, square brackets, 0, and this will return the value, whatever the value is inside of this cell. You have scores 1, it will return 50. You have scores 2, it will return 35, 34, and so on. Let's look at the challenge. You can follow along with me. You can create your own account if you want. I will just log into mine and solve the problem with you along. So just like I said in the slide before, you have two parts to this screen. You have a problem statement on the left with all the descriptions, inputs, constraints, outputs, and examples of what kind of data they're requiring you to analyze and return. On the right, you have your coding portion. So you can change, we'll try to solve it in a different language. There's a variety of languages that you can try to learn using this platform. And the one that I'm going to be using for this exercise is Python. So in this section, we'll be writing our code and our solution to this problem. Let's start by reading the problem. Given an array of integers, find the sum of its elements. So for example, in the array AR 1, 2, 3, we have to return the sum 6. Let's read the function description. Complete the simple array sum function in the editor below. It must return the sum of the array elements as an integer. So in Python, the way you declare a function is by specifying a keyword def, which stands for definition. You have the keyword, you have the name of your function, and you have the parameter that it accepts, which is AR. And AR is the array that we're going to analyze. Input format. The first line contains an integer n, denoting the size of the array. The second line contains n space separated integers representing the array's elements. So if you look at the description of input format and the input format itself, you can understand what kind of data you're going to be analyzing. The first line contains an integer n, and in this case, it's 6. And the second line contains n separated integers representing the array's elements, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 10, 11. In this particular problem, you can see that there is only one parameter passed in the function. This is because we're using Python. You can see that your function will receive, if this input is whatever is being tested, then this is the array that we're going to receive. And this is the output that we're gonna produce by our function. So let's start by solving the problem. We're gonna start by we can start by first thinking about the problem and seeing what is the general direction that we have to go to. So it asks us to compute the sum of each element of the array. That means that we have to look at each element of the array AR and then record their values in some variable and then accumulate those variables over time. Variables are just placeholders for data in programming. So for example, I will declare a variable called sum of the array. I'm using underscores here because this is the Python convention, and different languages have different conventions, and interviewers and recruiters generally pay a lot of attention towards the way that you write your code and name your variables and how you follow the conventions. So sum of the array is going to be equal, I will set it to 0 at first, because at the beginning, we have not looked at any of the elements and our sum is currently 0. Then what we have to do, as we discussed earlier, is that we have to look at each of the elements and then accumulate the sum over time. What I mean by look at each element is we can scan through all the values in the array and then work with them and record them in the array, our variable, sum sum of the array. The way we do it in Python programming language is by using a for loop. For loop is basically what allows us to introduce some kind of a variable and then use that variable to address the elements in the array. So for example, if we specify the keyword for and then specify the name of our variable, we can specify what kind of values it will take. So for example, we have our for loop with a variable index, and we say that index variable will take any value from 0 to number of elements in the array, because we want to look at each one. So if there is 3 elements in the array, we want to look at 0, the index number 0, index 1, and index 2, just like I showed in the presentation. But it shows us that number of elements is undefined. Undefined means that we haven't yet declared it. We have to declare it first. So we will write it here. Number of elements equals. To be able to get the number of elements in Python programming language, we can call a function called len. The len function returns the number of elements in a collection that is passed in the parentheses. In our case, that collection is array named AR, and we can pass it there. So for example, if we pass an array AR 1 to 3 in this function, it will return 3. So we recorded the number of elements of the array into a variable. And now we can use it to iterate it through the array. In Python, you put a semicolon when you start a new block. And our new block is our for loop. Press enter. Interviewer, I forgot to note, but interviewers also appreciate when a candidate puts comments in their code explaining what they're doing. That not only shows the ability of you solving some kind of a problem, but also shows your knowledge that the code has to be readable and maintainable, because other people will also look at it in the real world scenario. So we'll put a comment here. A variable that stores the sum of the array. And here we'll put a variable that stores the number of elements in the array. Here we'll put iterates over elements of the array. Now, if you remember that array is a collection of elements that is accessible through square brackets, we can now access the element by calling array, which is AR, square brackets, index. Now we have the element of the array, which is called element for us. And since we need to record the sum of all the elements in the array, we'll perform the following operation. We'll call our variable called sum of the array, and we will add the element, the current element, to the sum. So if we're looking at 1, we say that sum of the array 0 plus 1 will equal 1. And then we will look at 2, and we'll say 2 plus 1 equals 3. And then since sum of the array will be 3, we'll look at 3, and we'll say 3 plus 3 equals 6. And this is going to be our answer. So the way we write it is we reassign sum of the array to the value of sum of the array plus element. And we'll put a comment here. Computes the sum of the elements. And this variable is going to be retrieves element of the array. Then we'll put a return keyword, which in Python means simply just the returning a value from a function. So for example, just like we called len function and it returns the number of elements, our function will return the sum of the array. So we'll say return sum of the array. Now, the last step that you want to do every time you're looking at some kind of an assignment or a problem in a coding challenge, you want just to review the problem statement, review the constraints, and then make sure that your code is valid and you don't catch any immediate errors. So let's check again. We have the sum. We have to return the sum of the array. Input constraints are 0 to 1,000 for any of the elements. So the length of the array will be less than 1,000, and the elements of the array will be 1,000. Now I'm not going to talk about constraints too much because it's a little bit advanced topic, and if you want to learn more about it, then we'll host it in a different workshop. But for now, we'll just look at other aspects of the coding interview. And now we'll come back to our code, and we'll see that, okay, we'll have sum of the array, which is equal to 0. We have number of elements. We'll loop through all the elements in the array, access the element, add it to the sum, and then at the end, when we loop through all the variables, all the values of the array, we'll return the sum. So let's click run code and see how it performs. Hooray, sample test case 0 passed. Very important. You have, for each sample test case, you have your input, just like it's specified in the input format. The first line contains integer n, the second line contains n, the n space integers. So this is our n number, this is our n integers. This is what our function returned because it says your output, and this is what it expects. Now we can also, and this is important, we can also test our own input, just in case there's not enough test cases given in the prompt, and we want to make sure that our program runs correctly. So for example, I will say that n is equal to 5, and now I'm going to list 5 integers that my function is going to compute the sum for. So for example, it's going to be like 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. So just by looking at our custom input, we'll see that our function should return 10 plus 20 plus 30 plus 40 plus 50 will be 150, right? Yes. Yes. Let's see if it responds properly to our custom input. Yay. 150 is the correct answer. Now that you tested, you looked over your code, you read through the prompt again, and you made sure that you understand what did you do. You commented everything out. You press submit code. Congratulations. We solved the first challenge. You can see that there was 3 test cases. One of them was seen in the prompt, and the other 2 are hidden. Hidden test cases are very important in the process of the interviews because they're not going to be given to you, and they're going to test your code for edge cases. Edge cases are different scenarios of input that your recruiter or your company or your platform is going to look for incorrect test correctness. So in this problem, it's difficult to think about different edge cases. But for example, in the live interview, you could ask, okay, how many elements are there? Okay, what if the number of elements and given n does not match? All these questions should be either specified in the prompt, or if they're not specified, you have to talk about those. Let's submit the code again. It works. Now, very important, there also could be a follow-up question to you after you solve the problem. So for example, we could make this code much shorter and more concise. So for example, we could call sum of the array just sum AR, because we don't want to waste a lot of space by typing characters. And recruiters are looking at your naming variables and how you're getting used to calling variables different names. So we'll rename all the all these with the sum of the array. Now, number of elements, you can just call n, because that's how they call it in the prompt, and this is understandable, especially when you commented that and explain to the recruiter what are you doing. You say range 0 to n. We don't have to store the retrieved element in a separate variable. We can just add it directly to our sum. So this is how we're going to do it. Additionally, it's a convention in computer science to call indexes I, J, K, M, P, Q, etc., unless it's confusing and it's not specified. So you can just say ARI. Let's see if our code works. 150 sounds good. Now, this is not the shortest version. The shortest version in Python would be just calling the sum function. And we'll see if it performs well and it sums our code perfectly. Now, not all programming languages have the sum function embedded in them, and it's best to talk with your recruiter and see if they want you to use built-in functions in the programming languages. But usually you would want to implement your own functions. Exceptions include sortings, include different optimization techniques, etc. We're going to cover those maybe later. And that was the first problem that we solved. Do you have any questions about the first problem or maybe the platform? I can explain anything if you didn't get that. Sound good? Any questions, guys? Do you think that was too easy? Okay, well, we'll proceed to next problem that we have on the list. Oops, I need to press that. The next problem that we have is, this is the solution to simple array sum. If anyone wants to look at it or take a screenshot or copy it, then feel free to do so now. Oh, I see the question from Stefan. He asks, what level of difficulty are these questions usually? Well, I just posted, I just showed you a very simple question. Usually it depends on the company. So some companies ask easy questions. It depends. Some companies ask medium level questions. Some companies ask very hard questions. It depends on the field that you want to go on, if it's web development, machine learning, if it's finance, etc. But you have, every time you get a coding challenge for you from the company, it's a good idea to usually, look up the company. Some people on Reddit say what difficulty is it. Some people have recommendations with regards to a particular company, etc. So it all depends on the company, but usually they're medium, easy. Sometimes they're hard. We'll talk about difficulties later. I will show you. Okay, any more questions before we jump into the next problem? Oh, I see. I see that other people are also saying, can we do it by a recursion function? Let's see. I mean, yes, we could do a recursion function. We could, for example, declare a index 0, sum the element, and then call the same function using the next index until the index is out of bounds. But for this kind of problem, I don't see why we would do that. especially when calling a recursive function causes the function call stack to increase in size. Okay, I don't see any other questions. Stefan, did I answer your question? Yes, someone said that I can use the shortened version, which is just, I could use, so for example, when we had our code, when we had our code, we could just say for I element in array, and that will automatically return the element that you're accessing, so 1, 2, 3. So you don't have to have the index variable. But it is important to understand how it works underneath, and some languages don't have what is called a for each loop. This is a for each loop. And it is important to understand what for each loop does under the hood. And by showing that you know how to index the array, you're also showing one of the skills that you have. Okay, let's talk about second problem. Okay, second problem is called diagonal difference. It is about matrices, and matrices are simply two-dimensional arrays. So for example, if you remember from previous slide, an array is just a collection of elements of the same type. You see on this slide that the matrix is just a two-dimensional array. It has rows and columns and has all the elements. The difference between the two-dimensional array and a one-dimensional array is that the operators that you use to access elements correspond to the dimensionality of the array. So if it's a two-dimensional array, you use two operators to access a single element. 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3. Row 2, 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3, and so on, so on. You see that it's also 0 indexed. So row 1, column 1 will be 0, 0, and row 2, column 2 will be 1, 1. It is an important concept, and I hope that you're comfortable with that. Okay, let's go to the challenge. Okay, let's start by reading the prompt. Given a square matrix, calculate the absolute difference between the sum of its diagonals. So again, you have a general problem statement, and then you have the example. For example, the square matrix R is shown below: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 8, 9. This is, as you can see, is a 3 by 3 matrix. Since the number of rows and number of columns are equal, you can just it's called square. And you can see in this function, we have a parameter called array, short for array, and this is the kind of input they're going to receive in the function. So in this example, the diagonals are 159 and 359. And so you see that their sums appropriately are 15, 17, and the absolute difference is 2. So now you have function description. Complete the diagonal difference. Diagonal difference function is here. And diagonal difference takes the following parameter. You have an array of integers, which is denoted by ARR, n rows, m integers, but in this case, rows and integers are the same length. That's why it's called square. Okay. Does anyone have any idea how would you solve that before we jump into solving the problem? Any ideas about how to solve the problem? Okay, I will read the question. Can you see the prompt, or is it too small? Hold on. Okay. Again, just like in the previous problem, we have a function that we have to implement, and this function accepts an array as a parameter, but this time is a 2D, is a two-dimensional array. And for example, the square matrix array R is shown below. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9, 8, 9. We have 3 rows and 3 columns, and this is called a two-dimensional matrix. And so the task is compute the absolute difference of the diagonals of the matrix. So in this case, you have diagonals 1, 5, 9, and the diagonal 3, 5, 9. And so you compute the sum of the diagonals, and then you take their absolute difference, which is denoted by vertical bars, and you return it from the function. Does that make more sense? I see one of the people posted a probable solution, and it says, you can traverse the array setting row and column to be the same, so the complexity will be 2 multiplied number of rows. Well, you're on the right track, because that will give you one of the columns, but how are you going to define the next column? I mean, the one's diagonals, but how are you going to find the other diagonal? Okay, let's look again at the slide for a second. To solve this problem, you have to understand the concept of 2D matrix and notice a pattern here. So for example, let's crop this one to make it a square matrix. Now we can consider it better. Okay. Now we have a 3 by 3 matrix. Wait, I see some comments there. One of the people said, so for the left diagonal, the J value increases for every I, and for right, some of the J value decreases from the length of the array to 0. Yes, that's right. So what this person says is that for the left diagonal, which is this one, the J value increases for every I. So they say that this index, the first index, they usually call it I index, and this is the second index, J. So for every I, it increases by 1, and for the right column, the J value, which is the second value that you address, decreases by 1. 2, 1, 0. Yeah, this is closer to the truth. Let's see if we can solve it. So again, we will have to have 2 different variables that hold the sums of 2 diagonals. Sum right diagonal. Just like in the previous problem, we will set the initial sum to be 0 because we want to add elements and we haven't looked yet at any of the elements. And this we have holds right diagonal sum. And the second variable will be holds left diagonal sum. The right and left diagonal sums refer to right diagonal, left diagonal, and right diagonal. I think so, yeah. I have a problem understanding right and left, so sorry for that. Sum left diagonal. Let's see if anyone said anything in the comments. Yeah, both indices increased by 1. If we can notice in the slide, if we look at the slides, we'll see that for the main diagonal, which is this one, all the values increased by 1. And even more than that, we can see that both of the values are equal for the main diagonal, CC 0, 0, 1, 1, 2, 2. So now we can actually find the sum of the main diagonal. Just like in the previous problem, we have to introduce some kind of index. So we'll say for index 1, I will be even more clear. We can see that for each of the elements in the matrix, the first number corresponds to the row number. So row 1, 0, row 2, 1, row 3, 2. And the second number refers to the column number. So you have column 1, 0, 0, 0, column 2, 1, 1, 1, column 3, 2, 2, 2. So we can name our indexes column and row respectively. We'll say for row in range 0 to rows, and then for each row we'll look at for each row 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 8, 9. We'll look at each element individually. So we need a second iterator, which we'll call column in range. So we see that it highlights the variables rows and columns because we again haven't introduced them. So let's introduce the values. Holds the number rows and we see that the matrix is called a square matrix because it has the same number of rows and columns. So we'll say rows equals and columns equal the same number. Now, the way we find the number of columns and rows is just like in the previous problem, we'll say len ARR. And this way, it will give us the length of the array. The length of this array will be the amount of rows in the matrix. So if we call len array for this specific matrix, it will return us 3 because there's 3 rows in them. Noah says you can also just use one for loop and access the length minus 1 minus index element for the right diagonal. Right, you can also do that. But for now, just to make the solution more clear for new members, we can also just use 2 indexes. So for the main diagonal, we check if the values are equal, just like we saw in the presentation. For the main diagonal, we see that the values are the same, 0, 0, 1, 1, 2, 2. So let's do that. The way we check if a condition is true, so for example, if row is equal to column, we say we write the if keyword, and it introduces an if statement. And we say if column is equal to row, and then we'll say comment here, checks the main diagonal condition. So if it's a main diagonal, we'll say sum left diagonal array row column. So if this condition is true, then we have to add the element which is indexed by row and column from the array to our sum. Now the other condition checks for the other diagonal condition. Now we have to come up with the other diagonal condition. Yeah. So Mayank says, so for the second diagonal, the sum of I and j will be the same as n. Well, almost. If you look at the presentation, we have 3 rows, so n is equal to 3. And if we look at the opposite diagonal, we see 2, 0, 1, 1, 2, 0. So the sum of the indexes will be equal to n minus 1. Is that clear? Let's write it down. If column plus row is equal to rows minus 1, sum right diagonal, we just add our element to the other sum. And these are our 2 conditions. So now we have our 2 sums. The only thing that's left from the prompt is find their absolute difference. And the way we find absolute difference is by calling the ABS function, which is absolute function. And we pass our sum right diagonal minus sum left diagonal. The order doesn't matter here since it's an absolute function. And then just like in the previous prompt, we say return answer. You can also say, to be more descriptive, absolute difference. Now the function runs correctly, and we see that the output is proper. If we want to test again against some kind of other input, for example, this one, we just insert it here. Just like it's specified in the input format. Let's say run code, processing, and it returns 2. If we see in the prompt again, their absolute difference is 15 minus 17 equals 2. And this is correct. Now, one more thing that I forgot to mention at the very beginning is that the process of debugging is very important in these kind of questions. So for example, if you're doing something wrong, so for example, if I say, instead of sum left diagonal equals, not plus equals, and I'll say run code. We see that we get wrong answer. And so you might think, what's wrong with my question? The answer, how to find your issue, is that you can put a print statement here. So for example, print the sum of the left diagonal is, and you put sum left diagonal. This way you can see what your code is doing at this point in the code. You can go down and see debug output. So the sum of the left diagonal is 11, the sum of the left diagonal is 5, and the sum of the left diagonal is minus 12. And we see that these numbers correspond to individual elements. So we see, okay, I have to sum it up first. So I put a plus here, I run the code, and I remove all the print statements before I submit the assignment, and I submit the code. You see there was 10 test cases, and they're all hidden to be able to test your functionality. Well, there's 4 minutes left to the meeting, so does anyone have any last questions with regards to our presentation? I had actually 2 more questions to cover, but we ran out of time, unfortunately. But if you guys like this kind of session and you want to solve more coding problems, then Google Developers Club will host another session that will cover advanced topics. And I can cover medium questions, I can cover hard questions, and we can talk about algorithms, complexity, efficiency, different paradigms, etc. Because this is just the beginning. These are very, very simple problems that you probably won't get because they're too simple, because you have to account for all of these different concepts. So what do you guys think? I don't see any questions. Yes. Well, guys, if you don't have any questions, leave feedback that you have about the session and join us in the next couple of weeks to cover more advanced topics. Does that sound good? I'm new. The question is asked in the chat. I'm new to Python. Can you suggest me any good books that talk about data structure in Python? Thanks in advance. So these are the resources that I have currently right now, especially this link, Geeks for Geeks, is a very informative, quite informative website that talks about data structures in many different languages. So for example, you could go to Python. Oops, no. You could say, so for example, I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah, you could just try to solve these kind of problems, and then if you have any kind of difficulties, you can just look up their solution on the internet. So for example, you can go diagonal difference Geeks for Geeks, and you have the article that explains very in detail about what this problem is asking and the solution to it. I can also talk about the resources that you might consider in the next meeting. Yeah. No, I did not get a position at Google, but I tried very hard. Thank you. Thanks for the feedback, Mayank. We'll organize the advanced session in the next couple of weeks. Stay tuned. You can also message me on my email if you have any questions about preparation, because I know it is a hard topic and it can be stressful. So the more you know, the better it is for you. I guess that's it. Thanks for coming.